Thank you very much. Well, it's very, very nice to be back to my alma mater. I mean, it's always a great pleasure and honour to get invited back to Cambridge, and it brings back memories of student life and all that stuff. So it's great to be back. I came 2 years ago, as Peter's just said, and spoke to launch, in effect, in a small group like this book called The Precariat, and I have a few copies if anybody's interested at the end. And since then, something's in the water, because I've been invited to present it at over 200 venues in 30 countries. And it's sold thousands and thousands of copies. It's been translated into 10 languages. And it's just coming out in 2 more languages, Russian and Greek. It's very strange when you're an academic when that sort of thing happens to you, because it doesn't happen more than once in a lifetime, and probably you don't expect it ever to happen. And it's very extraordinary that everywhere I've been, the left is in a state of crisis. The left has lost its distinctive voice, its capacity to formulate a vision or a strategy to realize any vision, and has become increasingly utilitarian and trying to go for the squeezed middle and play middle-class politics and try and out-language the others with buzzwords and things. And for someone who's been on the left all his life, that is extraordinarily dispiriting, really dispiriting. And I was thinking on the train coming here, you know, it's strange, it's even anachronistic to be a Fabian in 2014, if you think about it. Because, you know, you're 100 years old and you must have some new way of articulating a progressive vision. That, I think, is fundamental for all of us. We always need to be refreshing based on our values. We believe in equality, we believe in reducing the insecurities of people, but we have to reinvent our vision of how to realize that for each new generation. And it's one of the greatest tragedies that the period I'm going to be talking about that has been a conspicuous failure. I've been invited for some reason to Sweden a lot in the last few months. The last talk I gave in Malmo just before Christmas, I thought I was going to be speaking to a nice group like this. Over 700 people came. Extraordinary. And it was all because they feel the great social democratic traditions of Sweden are finished. The Swedish model, which when I was a student was the nirvana for progressives. We all thought the Swedish model was the best thing since cheese had been invented. And yet today, if the Swedish Social Democrats get 30% in the general election coming up this year, they will think themselves fortunate. And their leaders have told me that. Oh, why? They don't have a vision and a strategy for the things I want to talk about. Now, I think it's very important for anybody who calls themselves progressive and left, whatever you want to put yourself, we all believe in democracy, we believe in freedom, and we believe in redistribution, to start with a few principles. And the first principle I like to start on, which is why I wrote this book called Work After Globalization. You will notice it's called Work After Globalization and not Labour After Globalization. Is that those of us on the left must realize that work is not the same thing as labour. It's a fundamental value point. And the tragedy of the 20th century was Labour parties and Social Democrats put labour, the performance of subordinated work for bosses, on a pedestal and made social policy, economic policy, and rhetoric of politics around labour. So all the forms of work that women do in particular and that voluntary work and civilized work and participation in the life of the polis don't count. They disappear from our statistics, our political rhetoric, and our social policies. So we have a situation where we're driving more and more people into jobs for the sake of jobs, whereas we've always denigrated the work that people are doing that are not counted. This is a fundamental starting point if you're on the progressive left. We have to reintegrate work rights, not labour rights. Now, I've developed that point. I'm not going to go into it any further, but it's the starting point of what I'm going to be talking about. The second contextual point I want to make is that the 20th century can be interpreted as a Karl Polanyi great transformation in which the period of the 19th century up to 1929 and the 30s was the disembedded phase of the Great Transformation, when financial capital was dominant, as Karl Polanyi saw it in his great book, until inequalities and insecurities multiplied. There was a big crisis, and as he put it, there was a threat of the annihilation of civilization, and we nearly had it. Only after that was there a period of re-embeddedness, where the welfare states came in, all based on labour, labourism and labour rights. I worked for the International Labour Organization for many years. I was a very senior bureaucrat in charge of technical programs, and I was constantly having to fight, saying, no, we must dignify work. We have to get social policies and regulations in favour of all types of work. And the unions were often the most vehemently opposed to that agenda. I have to say that great names in the trade union movements were often the most hostile to that feminist agenda. Now, the Polanyian Great Transformation broke down in the 1970s, and Thatcher and Reagan took advantage of that, ushering in this period of neoliberalism, which can be interpreted as the disembedded phase of a global transformation. And what that means is that the Polanyian Great Transformation was based on the creation of national markets, with regulations, redistribution, and social protection geared to national closed economies. That could not continue once the global market system started to emerge. So it broke down from its own contradictions. I won't go into that in detail, but I think it's useful to keep that in the back of your minds. And when it broke down, neoliberalism came into ascendancy, which means not something that we can all throw insults at people we don't like, but it meant deliberately fostering an individualistic, competitive market system with an open liberalization of all markets. And crucially, fundamentally to understanding the Hayek, Friedman, Thatcher, Reagan, and onwards into Blair, is that it meant a systematic dismantling of all institutions and mechanisms of social solidarity. All mechanisms, including collective bargaining, including occupational communities, including all systems that stood against the market. They were all regarded as rigidities, as undermining competitiveness, and therefore impeding labour flexibility, etc., etc. We're all familiar with the rhetoric. So that they went ahead, and what they created is a dystopia of individualism and competitiveness. Now, in the process, what has happened is a number of great things have been evolving, which is the context in which we are going to have progressive politics for the future. And that starts with the very basic fact that with the liberalization in the 1980s, we effectively saw a trebling of the world's labour supply. Overnight, historically speaking, an extra 2.5 billion people became part of the global labour market. Every single one of them were resigned and habituated to labouring and working for 1/50th of what any British worker would have accepted as normal. That is the reality from which we started. Now, any economist of any school of thinking would tell you that that happens to start a great convergence. You're going to get downward pressure on our wages long before you get upward pressure of wages and benefits. But in the longer term, there's going to be a convergence with this downward pressure. Now, while governments, particularly New Labour, I'm afraid to say, and we've got to be honest, went about pursuing a policy of labour market flexibility, which was doing all these dismantling, not deregulation, re-regulation, in favour of individualism, in favour of capital against unions and so on. While that happened, we had a Faustian bargain. The Faustian bargain was you can have an orgy of consumption, you can run up debts, we'll give you tax credits, we'll give you more tax credits, and we'll give you more tax credits, and cheap consumer credits, and cheap loans. But gradually the debts were rising. It was postponing the day of reckoning which came in 2008, since when we've had the austerity era, when we're all being told we've got to cut living standards. So what we've seen in effect in that context is this global class fragmentation that has taken place. The global class fragmentation, which I'm not going to go through, it's dealt with in my book, but essentially we've got a plutocracy, an elite, a salariat doing quite well but shrinking in numbers. The old working class, the core, the proletariat, not disappeared but shrinking everywhere. And we have to remember that the Fabian agenda was based on that part of the working class, the proletariat. Those people who were doing stable, full-time labour, breadwinner jobs, with their wives or whatever as caregivers back in the secondary labour market. And the phony image of full employment, which never existed, because women weren't counted, migrants weren't counted, etc. They were there, they lived, they worked. So we had a situation where the new class structure has produced a vast and growing precariat. And the precariat has a very distinctive class structure to it. And this is where progressive politics is going to have to address. I had a call yesterday as I was preparing to come here from a very senior member of the shadow cabinet. I was very surprised. I said, aha, finally you're seeming to get through to some key people. And I've also been invited to talk about this in the People's Parliament in Westminster at the beginning of March. So there's something in the water, right? But the precariat has three distinctive characteristics, which you can use in Marxian terms or you can use in social democrat. You don't have to be a Marxist to understand the precariat. The first is that it has distinctive relations of production. People are being casualized, they're being turned into external workers. They don't expect to have an occupational narrative which they can give to their lives. They don't know what they are. They have to do more and more work for labour that doesn't get counted as labour, that isn't remunerated. But if you're in the precariat, you have to do a vast amount of work merely to survive. Applying for jobs, retraining, doing this, networking, doing your CV, dealing with state bureaucracies, filling in forms. This is unprecedented. And so it leads to an enormous phenomenon of what I call the precariatized mind. The precariatized mind is that you don't know what to do to be optimal. It's a sort of existential insecurity. I don't know what to do to know what is the best thing for me to do. Now, I've received thousands and thousands of emails across the world, people saying, that's me. That's me. And this lack of control over time is a vital part of what I'm going to talk about in a couple of minutes. But in addition, this is the first class in history which is expected to have a level of education greater than the level of labour is expected to do. It's a very strange phenomenon. But unless you have a higher level of education than the type of job you're playing for, you won't get it. I know people who've had to apply thousands of times in order to get one interview. And they're educated and good people. It's a process of sifting which uses up a tremendous amount of time and stress for people. Now, in addition, the second distinctive characteristic of the precariat is that there are distinctive relations of distribution. Now, what that means is this is the first class in history which has to rely almost entirely on money wages. The old proletariat could have access to enterprise benefits, access to state benefits based on rights, access to community benefits and occupational benefits for belonging to different organizations. And I can document that quite easily. This is the first time when a mass of working people don't have access to any of those things. They don't have access to any enterprise benefits like pensions and medical insurance, paid holidays, maternity leave, you name it, which the salariat have in abundance. And they don't have access to state benefits that they can rely on. And this turns more and more of them into essentially supplicants. They are supplicants. Please, give me a benefit. If you're not outright begging, you are having to convince a bureaucrat. You're having to convince somebody that you're a deserving member of the poor. And the Ian Duncan Smiths and his predecessors in New Labour, let's not be honest, bring in sanctions and more assessment tests and more assessment tests. And this has been going on for the past 15 years, and you can document it very easily. Right? But what are we on the left doing about it? All right, come to that in a minute. And the third thing that defines the precariat, it's the first class in history with very distinctive relations to the state. Because it's the first class which is systematically losing acquired rights, losing cultural rights, losing civil rights. No due process when you lose your benefits. No due process. But that's fundamental to Magna Carta. And suddenly they're all being taken away and nobody's protesting. No political rights because there's no way of being represented and representing yourself against the power of a commodified democracy. No social rights because you don't have a rights-based social protection system anymore. We never did really. But you can't even get it through labour because your labour is so unstable and insecure you can't get access to insurance benefits and you don't get it as a right otherwise. And fundamentally then you lose economic rights because more and more people in the precariat have qualifications. They have skills. And in principle they should be able to practice what they're qualified to do. But they can't. So these three things define the precariat, and it produces a consciousness which is out there. And that consciousness is a sense of anomic alienation coupled with chronic anxiety, and this leads to anger. And this anger is boiling up, and every now and then you have days of rage. We've seen it in all the squares. When I was in Stockholm, they had 4 nights of arson and looting. When I went to Brazil, because the books come out in Portuguese, all the cities, and pure coincidence, had nothing to do with the book, but pure coincidence, you saw all these cities exploding with the precariat. It's the same in the Middle East. The precariat are getting more and more angry, and yet the left is silent. It's silent. So that's the context. Now, I think we need a new progressive strategy. I'm just going to, new books coming out. It's going to get me a lot of stabbings from various sources, I'm sure, if I survive at all, called A Precariat Charter. A charter, I thought, as the theme of the book is, if 100 years ago you were to draw up a charter like the Magna Carta with its 63 items, I hope everyone's familiar with the Magna Carta, with its 63, which was a class-based charter. And then we had the Chartists and so on. 100 years ago, if you'd had a proletarian charter, what would have been the demands? You know, if it's a nice exercise if you'd think what to put on it. And then I said to myself, what would be the equivalent of a precariat charter in 2040? So that's the theme of the book. And one of the big concerns I have is that the Labour Party and Social Democrats have bought into one particular policy which, as it happens, and I'm not claiming to be cleverer than any other soothsayer, but I wrote an article 20 years ago saying the logic of what is happening will lead inevitably to workfare. Because once you shifted to a flexible labour market where a lot more insecurities go in, you automatically get drawn back to means testing. Now, when I was a student, we thought that Richard Titmus's arguments against means testing was the end of the subject. You know, it would never come back. You know, policies that are only for the poor are inevitably poor policies. That's what he said. We took it as granted. No government in British history went further to reintroducing and strengthening means testing than New Labour. And this government has rode on saying, well, you started it, we can continue. Of course they can, logically. But means testing, what it does, it says you only get benefits if you prove you are poor and you prove you are a deserving member of the poor. This automatically creates poverty traps. A poverty trap means that if you slightly raise your income when you're dependent on a benefit, you are going to face a marginal tax rate of 80%, 90%, or over 100%. So it removes the incentive to take low-paying jobs. And because wages have been falling over the last 30 years, the replacement rate of low benefits goes up. So it looks as if it's high. Well, if you're unemployed, you're getting 80% of the wage that you could get. But in actual fact, it's because wages are coming down, so they lower benefits. But still, the poverty trap remains. Now, the last government and this government claim that the precariat, they don't call it that, face effectively a marginal tax rate of over 80%. That's what they say. I would argue it's higher because of the costs and the rest of it, and because there's been a shift to money wages. And money wages are what are taken into account. But let's say it's 80%. And Ian Duncan Smith, that wonderfully stupid man, he says that if his tax credit, universal tax credit comes in, universal credit rather, it will be lowered to 65%. So the precariat are expected to pay 65%. Meanwhile, how dare we think of raising the average tax rate on the salariat above 45%? Incentives would go. And don't forget they get a lot of subsidies, so their real effective tax rate is about 30%. And meanwhile, we're going to lower corporation tax to 20%. So the affluent and those earning income from capital will cry all the way to the bank because they have disincentives of 20 to 30% tax. Meanwhile, governments of both ilks say the precariat have to face 65%, 80% tax rate. Now, what sort of progressive policy is this? It isn't. It's abysmal. And it is the reality. It's not only the reality in this country, it's the reality in Germany, in Spain, in other parts of Europe. In Denmark, the marginal tax rate faced by the precariat is 84%. In Germany, it's 82%. All right, that's calculations by the governments of those countries. So it's not a disputable thing, and still we're continuing. Now we have a situation where we need a new way of looking at things. And I won't go into that other than saying that progressives always have believed in a redistributive strategy where the redistribution of the key assets of the economic system is the objective. The socialist project of the early 20th century was about the means of production. We all know the nationalization and all that stuff. Today, if you talk like that in a meeting of the precariat, as I do, if you started talking about that old socialist project, they say, forget it. Out of the room. What we need is a progressive strategy where the key assets of a tertiary society are made the subject of redistribution. What are they? Well, fundamentally, there are 5. The first key asset is security. If you're in the salariat or the elite or the others up here, you have total security. You can get insurance, you can get advisors, you can get all means of security. If you're down in the precariat, you have no security at all. We need a strategy for redistributing the asset of security. The second thing is time, control of time. We need a politics of time. Because if you're in those upper groups, you have plenty of time, plenty of control over time. You can get advisors, you can get people. I see there's even a new firm that's just been set up to offer the service of queuing in queues for anybody who wants to pay for it. So this means that the middle classes will be able to pay and not bother to queue and come back in an hour and they'll save themselves an hour, whereas probably that will increase the size of the queue. We laugh at it, but it's indicative of a trend that's taking place, whereas the forms, the complexity of forms that the precariat are expected to fill is shocking. It really is. The 40, 50 pages I've seen, I mean, you just give up. And I've got a PhD. But you give up, you just say, I can't, I haven't got the time, I can't do it, etc. So basically what we've got to do is have a politics and strategy for redistributing the control of time. The next key asset is quality public space. Again, those affluent groups, they have their second homes, they have their retreats, they have clear air and off to beautiful islands. Well, meanwhile, the privatization of public amenities and all our great commons, allotments are being sold off, museums are being sold off, public toilets in Manchester are being closed. This is happening systematically. So we need a strategy for rescuing the commons. Then we need a redistribution of financial knowledge. There should be a public right for everybody to have financial knowledge. If you're in the salariat, you can pay advisors and accountants and the rest of it. Down in the precariat, you not only don't have no capacity to pay for those things, you make mistakes and so you end up actually paying more than you needed to because you don't know how to manipulate the system. And we need a strategy for redistributing education. Because the commodification of education has meant that we have an increasingly dualistic system where the precariat are expected to go for countless retrainings and all that stuff, where an elite and up here is getting their ethical, liberating education as we imagined tertiary education to be. And finally, we need a strategy for redistributing the key thing of capital. Unless we have a strategy for redistributing all those 5 things, we aren't going to have a progressive strategy at all. I'll be blunt about it. And that leads me to the topic that I was asked to talk about, but it's not one and the other, because what I'm going to talk about is, in my view, intimately linked to this contextual analysis I've been trying to put forward. Since 1986, we've formed, in 1986, an international network called Bien, which initially, over a beer, when we were putting a group, there were philosophers, economists, leftists, and a group of us, and we wanted to form a network, so we kept our research in touch and our activist activities in touch with each other. And over a beer, I said, well, the obvious thing to do is call it Bien. And immediately everybody said, yup. Bien, of course, in French, well and good, it has a nice thing, but essentially meant basic income European network, in order to work towards going through the arguments, going through the costings, going through everything to promote a basic income. We've had successive congresses, and in our Barcelona Congress in 2004, we had so many people from Latin America and Asia and America and Japan and so on, that we renamed ourselves Bien, which was Basic Income Earth Network. We wanted to keep the Bien. And what has happened is extraordinary, because I will describe what I mean by basic income in a minute. But what's happened is that it's taken off in the most unlikely places. I can't honestly say that when we started, we would have thought that Alaska would become one of the beacons of basic income. I cannot honestly say that when we started, Brazil would become a beacon of the basic income movement, where in the middle of the 1990s, some brave people on the Workers' Party said, why don't we try it here? And today, over 60 million Brazilians are receiving effectively a monthly basic income, and the minister in charge has told me that they plan to keep on rolling it out to more and more people. I didn't honestly think that we would do a basic income pilot in Namibia, where a huge number of villagers received a basic income, and we saw that transform their lives. I didn't honestly think that in 2009 and 2010 we would launch basic income pilots in India. We just had 3 years of doing these pilots, and Sonia Gandhi asked us to go and give a private presentation of the outcomes. And I'm just telling Peter before we came in that while I was preparing this talk, I received an email saying that the United Nations in Delhi has given us $100,000 to organize an international conference on it. Now, I didn't honestly expect any of this, right? But we've just organized a petition in Europe where in a matter of a few months, without any money at all, we had 286,000 signatures of people demanding that the European Commission consider the feasibility of introducing basic income. Something's in the water. Now, what do I mean by basic income? Essentially, and it's nothing new, others have said it over the generations. Essentially, it means that every individual should have the right to receive a basic income. As a citizen of the United Kingdom, you should have a right to a basic income. That's the principle. It would be individual, so that every individual, a man or woman, has their own basic income. A child would have his or her own basic income at a lower level. It would be paid in cash, not in vouchers. So it would be non-paternalistic. It would not be means tested, so it would remove poverty trap situations. It would be a basic amount, so that you could survive in extremis on it, but you would not be living in luxury. And you would have supplements for disabilities, supplements for special needs, pregnancy or whatever, but the basic thing would be equal for all. It would not be labour tested, and it would be paid from replacing subsidies, a capital fund that I've talked about in the books, and so on. And in addition, you could use it as a stabilization instrument for the economy. In other words, you would need to have an independent basic income committee, just as you have an independent monetary committee to control interest rates, to depoliticize the changes in levels of a basic income once you introduced it. And what I'm proposing in the several articles is that you, besides a basic amount, which should be adjusted as economic growth goes up, so that it moves with economic growth, you could have a stabilization element, so that when an economy is moving towards full employment, so-called, then the amount of the stabilization amount would go down, and in a recession it would go up to compensate. So it would be a stabilization measure. Now, there are a reef of criticisms that have been made over the years, and I'll just go through them very briefly. The first one is affordability. You can't afford it. Well, Iran is now affording it, but we can think of all sorts of ways of affording it. We can replace subsidies, we can change our taxation systems, we can replace existing benefits that are all sorts going to middle class groups and so on, and we can develop capital funds like other countries are doing. I think the affordability argument is a pretty feeble one when you get to it, actually. The second one is that it would be giving a handout, something for nothing. This is what Liam Byrne and a few others of his ilk in the Labour Party like doing. Well, a lot of people get something for nothing. A lot of rich people, I thought we were on the left. A lot of people get a lot of things for nothing. They've never done a day's work of any description for what they get. And it's a lie to say that only the wealthy have done it because they've worked hard. We know all that. You don't need anybody in this room to be convinced of that. The third objection is that it leads to consumption of private bads. So that everybody will squander it on alcohol, drugs, sex, whatever it is, it's your weakness. As it happens, if you look at something like Benefit Street or any of the psychological experiments, people who are suffering from chronic insecurity are the most likely to consume private bads. They are most likely to turn in desperation. And in all our experiments that I mentioned a few minutes ago, extraordinarily, because even Sonia Gandhi said, oh, they'll all spend it on alcohol and tobacco. The actual reality in turning out has been that consumption of alcohol and tobacco has gone down, because people have got more control of their lives and more responsibility with their families, they're shifting expenditure and so on. But it's very interesting that that assumption that people will spend it on private bads, and you say, well, would you spend it on private bads if you had a little more income and you've got 2 small children? No, not me, but they would. It's always they would. But we're on the left, so we believe in people, don't we? So we shouldn't be buying that argument. The third argument, and this one, of course, we get thrown at all over the place by conservatives, it will reduce labour supply. Give people a basic income, then they will sit back on their asses and they won't work. Oh. Well, actually, the current system is what does that. The current system acts to create incredible moral hazards because there's no incentive to take low-paying jobs. It's all taxed away, right? So let's hear that argument from people who favour means testing, because it's means testing that does it. And what we're saying, in effect, with a basic income is, yeah, we give you a basic income. We're not going to chase you in more and tell you to take jobs in Amazon warehouses and things. It's your problem. We're telling you, though, that from now on, you will get a bigger return if you take a job, because you will retain a larger proportion. The poverty trap is removed. But what we found in all the experiments that have been done is actually it increases labour supply, because people have a greater sense of control, a greater ability to afford things that they need to take work and take jobs. This incredible finding in Brazil with the Bolsa Familia, as it's called, the thing I was describing earlier, is that women's labour force participation has risen since the introduction of the Bolsa Familia. In Namibia, women's labour force participation rose as a result of the basic income. In our Indian villages, the same result. And it's a fact that people feel they can participate and they feel a greater sense of control of their time. They often do more work, and psychological experiments in 6 or 7 countries have shown that, in fact, if you give people basic security, they become more dynamic, more confident, and more productive in their work. So it's the contrary to what the critics like to claim. The last point of the criticisms, you may think of others, and I've thought of them and gone through them, is that it could be inflationary, because you're pumping in extra money. That's the argument. But as I tried to explain at the beginning, it's actually a substitution of existing subsidies and existing systems. Another couple of the objections are that it would reduce the pressure to create full employment. I remember a prominent, extremely prominent, he's actually the leader now, of the Labour Party, raised this objection with me at a retreat before he became leader. And I answered him and say, look, there is no pressure to get full employment. If you'd said this in the 60s, that might be the case. But what pressure to get? We're talking about over 7% unemployment and a real level of labour slack of probably 15%, with all those zero-hour contracts and all that sort of stuff. Where is the pressure to get full employment? So this is not an argument of relevance to it. But in any case, you have certain advantages in the labour market, and he told me at the end of 3 days of our discussions, he said, I buy it. But so far I haven't seen any public statement to that effect. One always hopes, okay? And another objection, it's very interesting. The classic objection is, look, it's never been done. Never been done, so there must be something utopian, impossible, mad about it, you know, so it's never been done. Well, Albert Hirschman, who died recently, wonderful social scientist, wrote a short book which he talked about the 3 objections that are always raised when a new idea comes up, or a new old idea, right? He says that the first attack is that it's futile. It's futile. It won't work. Okay. The second is it fails perversity. It would have unintended negative consequences. And the third objection is it jeopardizes other things. And he went through in this book a whole series of policies and progressive ideas that had come up over the couple of centuries that he covered, where each time those objections came up. And each time, a decade or less after they'd been introduced, everyone would say, ah, it's obvious. Well, obvious. Like family benefits in the 30s. I mean, Peter Townsend, who joined our group a couple of years before he died, he recalled a number of times to me how when he was starting out, they were saying all those things about family benefits. So I think that objection is is quite wrong. But what are the positive claims about a basic income? I think one should start with the ethical, philosophical. And I go back to Tom Paine. Tom Paine, in 1795, if you read his Agrarian Justice and Common Sense, his argument essentially was that your and my wealth and good living and so on is actually due to the contribution of our forebears to a much greater extent than anything you and I have done. All right? And that in a sense, everybody doesn't know whose forebears made the big contributions. But we should think that there should be some sort of social dividend system so that everybody shares the largesse created by their contribution. It's not you or me, it's from the past. And I was asked last year to go to Middlesbrough. I don't know if anybody's from Middlesbrough, from that area. And I was taken up before my lecture, I was taken around. Now Middlesbrough and the surrounding areas in the 1830s was a tiny hamlet, a few hundred people. And then they discovered iron ore. And within 20 years, Middlesbrough became the centre of the Industrial Revolution and the centre of the British Empire. If you go to Sydney, Sydney Bridge was built by the workers in Middlesbrough. If you go to the Golden Gate Bridge in San Francisco, guess where it was built? Middlesbrough. If you go to the Indian railway system, most of it was built with iron ore products from Middlesbrough. The wealth of the south of England, and many of us in this room, is actually derived from the workers of Middlesbrough. And you go there today, and it's a derelict area that makes even this Benefit Street look relatively affluent. Boarded up houses, people without hope, the precariat everywhere, suffering, degradation, a terrible life. And you say to yourself, now isn't this a justification for saying that the descendants of the people who produced our wealth should also share in the benefits of the wealth they've created, and that our Etonian old boys who are monopolizing the government are enjoying every single day of every single year? So the ethical argument for redistribution is very strong. But we also know from experiments by psychologists that people who have basic income security are more altruistic, are more tolerant of others, and have an orientation to solidarity, which must be respected. And the final point, because we have to wrap up and I'm prepared to take a few questions, is that at the moment, those of us on the left have to ask a big question. We know inequalities, functional distribution of income, that's the share going to capital and share going to labour, are becoming more and more unequal. The inequalities are exploding. We all know that. Barack Obama, after 5 years in office, woke up to the fact in his State of the Union address. He didn't actually say anything about it. Will Hutton had a long article, he was moaning about it, but he didn't have anything to say about it. We need to do more than say it's terrible. And we must think in terms of a new system of distribution. Because what is happening is that we, as countries, are becoming rentier economies. More and more of the income that's coming from the global system, the financial markets and technology and resources, is going to a tiny, tiny elite. We know that, right? So we need capital funds to get part of that, to make it like an Alaska Permanent Fund, or like the Norwegians had the wisdom to create a sovereign wealth fund, from which you can use the returns to pay for a basic income. That's what we need to think. Now I'm about to go back to India, and I want to end, if I can, if I don't break down, I apologize if I do. But when we started our basic income experiment, we gave to thousands of villages. And one of the things we did was we weighed all the babies and children. And we measured their height and their nutritional status. And the WHO has what's called a Z-score. It's a normal distribution of weight for age for small children aged 0 to 5. So globally, the distribution is a normal distribution, right? In a developing country in rural areas, it's skewed to the left. In other words, high proportion are malnourished, and then you get a few who are normal. And in Indian villages, the girls get the last bit of food, the last bit of medical treatment, the last everything. So they are even more skewed to the left. After 1 year of the basic income, so each individual received it, we did the same thing. And I said, Mozart is playing. Like that. But girls, like that. It was fantastic. Thank you very much.
Very much for that. That was really passionate, moving, charismatic speech. And I learned a lot from it. I hope you did too. Has anyone got any questions about?
If you were speaking to the Shadow Cabinet today, what would you advise them?
In fact, I have spoken to the Fabians. I think they've got to start altering the language. They've got to start by recapturing the language. I think that Liam Byrne, for example, played into the hands of Ian Duncan Smith. I mean, Ian Duncan Smith made an incredible statement when he said, "Work makes you free." He said it on a video. He said it on television. When I heard him, did you see it? Yeah. When I heard him, I thought I must get this correct, because if I write it and it's wrong, it's really serious libel. And he did say it, and we all know where that was written, on a infamous gate. Exactly. And instead of tearing into the workfare tendencies, what the Labour Party has done, and the latest replacement of Liam Byrne, I read her speech last week, and she's exactly the same, is they don't want to be outflanked. So they are making the same sounds. Any young person who's unemployed for a year or more is going to have to be forced to take a job, a menial job, etc. And I've got a whole lot of quotations from Ed Miliband's speech on this subject in Peckham last year, which anybody on the left should read and digest, because it is a terrible speech. And I would say to them, you've got to start moving away from conditionality. You've got to start moving away from the language of Blair and so on about no rights without responsibilities, etc. You've got to say that we have to trust people, we have to move in the direction so that you don't turn victims into demons. And the Labour Party, unfortunately, has not picked it up, because they don't want to offend what they perceive as the white male working class. That was Liam Byrne's real concern, and he said it a number of times. And they don't want to offend the middle class, in the squeezed middle. And I think that is fundamentally based on a fallacy, because if you shift to the right like that, the real right will say thank you very much, and people will say, well, why don't we vote for the real thing? We don't want to vote for these people when they don't probably realize. But you're failing at the same time to make the case that it's wrong. That is so tragic about this situation. You're not making a case for a progressive politics. And this is where we are at in 2014. I'm not arguing, please don't get me wrong, I am not arguing for a call to the barricades or something like that. They're tumultuous times, but we've got to realize that those of us on the left have to find a way of recapturing the language of progressive politics. We've got to be in favour of emancipatory reforms. We've got to be in favour of addressing the concerns of the precariat. And that's why this senior shadow cabinet minister contacted me yesterday, because they are beginning to realise they're not resonating. They think they can tiptoe back by being responsible. That's what they do. And I think that's fundamentally flawed. I really do. And in a sense, many of us will say, well, if you want to do that, we've got short Anglo-Saxon words for you. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. And that shouldn't be necessary. Okay? I'm not calling for, but I am calling for a sense of progressive politics, so that we can all smell it, and we can't. And as long as that continues, then I think that they may dribble back, perhaps. Even that's looking questionable. But it's the same in Sweden. It's the same, and that's why it's very strange. But the Left Party and the Greens in Sweden are actually more to the left than the Social Democrats, and they're gaining votes. They're gaining ground. So I think that really it's a time for bravery on the left. It really is, because we can't continue like this. What's the point of being on the left? What's the point? So I think that basically I would say to them, you have to find a new language, but don't play the game that the Conservatives and the others are playing. That's basically how I'd start. And my 29-point charter might be thrown in.
Anyone else got a question?
Hi, thank you for the talk. It's very interesting. I've just got a very basic question, trying to envisage how basic income might work in the UK. Do you have an idea of what sort of amount it would be and how it would compare to existing unemployment benefits and so on? And kind of how is it compared in the places where you can pilot?
Well, where we've done the pilots, it works out to be about 40% of subsistence, 30 to 40 depending on the place. I'm all in favour of actually moving steadily upwards, starting at a modest level, partly in response to the political concerns. So I would like to do rather something like what was done with Alaska. Alaska started with creating this capital fund, and that every resident of Alaska received an annual dividend from the fund. So it started at a very small level and then built up over time. But if you think of the typical unemployment benefit, and you said £75 a week, which is more than what most of them received, actually, then you could start at that level. But I would say that you build it up by converting other things and reducing the conditionality as you go. I think that's the first thing to do, is to move away from conditionality and means testing. So one of my articles is have a bonfire of assessment tests. Most of these tests should be phased out. I think that you've got to think of it that way. In the longer term, you would hope it would move up towards the equivalent of minimum wage, full-time employment. But I think that you have to build it in components. And the good arguments for it are that you can get a big increase in security and people's control over their lives at a relatively small amount. It's having the assurance of something, having the right. We've got a chapter in the book that we're just producing on the Indian experiments where I'm arguing that the emancipatory value of the basic income is greater than the monetary value. Because giving people liquidity and assured flow of money enables them to escape the equivalent of the Wonga debt traps, which are very, very serious in developing countries, obviously, because people are having to borrow at 100%. And the very fact that you have liquidity enables people to pool within your family or within your neighborhood and escape the landlords and the money lenders in a trap. Liquidity, where cash is a scarce resource, is a very important value for the left. You know, if in a situation where cash, money, is the scarce commodity, then getting control of it and getting it redistributed is a big part of a progressive strategy. So in actual fact, we were very surprised in the Indian villages that the effects were much greater than we thought the values of the amounts came to. But people were pooling, they were saving, they were paying down their debts, they were avoiding going into other debts and so on. And therefore the actual value was transformative. They've been building toilets, they've been improving their walls, they've been buying seeds, they've been buying small implements, and productivity's gone up. Storage facilities they've been building. But once they got control, they've escaped debt bondage and the result in the multiplier effects on those local communities has been what's transformed them. And I think that you can get a big buck with a fairly small start.
It strikes me that it might be worth talking to the SNP, because if to convince people in this country that this isn't something that it is perhaps for less well-off countries around the world and wouldn't work in European conditions, you're going to need pilot projects of some kind or another, aren't you? You need a government with the guts to say, right, we'll try this out in the Midlands in Cornwall or something like that. That's the way forward, if there is a way forward, which I very much hope there is. But I mean, Alex Salmon and his party members could pull it off in Scotland quite easily.
Well, I'll let you into a secret. I've been invited to Scotland a number of times, and I was speaking in the Scottish Parliament, and the Scottish, I'm not Scottish, and the Radical Independence campaign asked me to be a keynote speaker at their fantastic, it was a very exciting conference. I had to begin by saying, look, I'm not a nationalist of any sort, but I went through the basic income, and extraordinary applause. I mean, it was really, and I was saying, whoops, this is really hot water here. And I do think that in Scotland there's a genuine hope that they would introduce it. And they've already talked about, behind the scenes, about pilots in certain areas. And now in Sweden there are people talking that if the government changes, which I think it will, so there's a new coalition, the Greens are going to insist that some pilots be tested. Now, I'm keeping my fingers crossed because anything can happen in politics, but it's beginning. And we had this petition that the last few months where with no money at all, we got 286,000 signatures demanding that the European Commission launch pilots. So it's taking off, but it does require political courage. And it does require a lot of energy by progressives. And I feel it's coming because people are fed up with a vacuum on the left. And the precariat is getting angrier and angrier and more disillusioned. So they listen to a comedian talking nonsense about, getting out of politics and not participating in politics. But that's because the left is not offering a vision. And that's the real crisis.
Okay.
On that point.
We might. I think we'll be kicked out in a second. I'm afraid.
Good.
But yeah, thank you very much.
I've got a few copies if anyone's interested in the book.
So I'll just say a few words. We have some, just quickly, we've got some other events this time. I'll just run through. Next Thursday we've got a professor coming to talk about the privatisation of the probation service in Anglo-Ruskin University. And then the following week we've got a debate amongst ourselves on feminism and patriarchy. On the 27th of Feb, which is a Thursday, John Denham, the Right Honourable John Denham MP is coming. It was about how left is Labour. How left is Labour.
I'll be a fly on the wall.
And just draw your attention to right at the end, so the 5th of March is going to be our annual Amber Reeves Memorial Lecture in honour of family member Amber Reeves, which will have Professor Lynn Siegel, who's a eminent feminist activist and author of many books on feminism, is coming to talk to us here. If you would like to join or be put on our mailing list, you can talk to me after, and I can take down your email address to put you on the mailing list. But thank you very much, guys, for an amazing talk. Thank you.
I think it's worth saying that Lynn Siegel has written an amazingly compelling book about people's life and falling in their lives.
Well, it's fine. It's fine. And then that's great. Yes, 10:50. So if you just come. So it's basically the door opposite.
I'll come back to that. £5 discount. £15. I don't make any money out of it.
No,